I think following up on I'll also just say a few words that, the idea of the Climate Congress was really to kind of, think about how some of the thinking that was involved in the development of the Biennale, that is to say, understanding ecologies and sustainabilities as the kind of the core theme of the exhibition, but how to understand those and develop those ideas in ways that took the perspectives of Lahore and Pakistan and Asia, right? Understanding kind of locally, but also asking that question of what counts as local. And I really am pleased that, I think Tamara kind of, in her conversation, opened that up in some ways and kind of unsettled some of our understandings of what Silk Road might mean, for instance, but also I think the way that geography functions and philology functions to both determine and undetermine some of the ways that we understand our world, right? So, and also kind of to expand the network of interlocutors. So, I think that one way of understanding ecologies or understanding environment that, has been bandied about is like, oh, well, Pakistan has its own needs, it needs to take care of that first. But I think that, when we're dealing with something like ecology and environment, one thing that's, everyone can agree on is that, the air doesn't care if it's on Pakistan's side or India's side. Yesterday we went to the Wagah border to pick up one of the delegates, and the person at the station said, well, the pollution is coming from both ways, right? It kind of goes across the border. It doesn't recognize these man-made borders. And so I think it behooves us to kind of think beyond this kind of nationalist kind of, framework and to understand these things in a kind of larger understanding. But also I liked what Tamara was saying in terms of, the ecophilology and the emphasis on affect and thinking about the way that kind of, allows us to see how things that we think of as being very little and very small and kind of beneath attention really help shape the fundamentals of our world and our outlook. I mean, we can talk more about this, but maybe, given that we're kind of running a little late already, I'd like to just kind of shift into the conversation today with Haegue. And first of all, thank you, Haegue, for being here. And Haegue is proposing that this can be an open conversation. So, it's not just the two of us, talking, but also if people want to interject, you're free to kind of to talk and share. So this is your second time in Lahore. I'm just going to share that, one of the reasons why Haegue is here and why Haegue did a project for Lahore Biennale is because before she even knew anything about my being involved with Lahore Biennale, one day she just blurted out, I want to go visit Lahore. And I was like, I know how that can happen. So I'm really pleased to see that it's happened. Now it's your second time in Lahore. And the project that we have on view in the Biennale is both Spring Sailors, which is at Shalimar Gardens, which we saw this morning, and also Gleaner's Notebook, which is on view and available at Pack Tea House. And given that the audiences here aren't necessarily so familiar with the work, this is the first time you're showing here, I was thinking that this could be a helpful way to contextualize your work and think about, where you're coming from. And so I think we're going to look at that, but I also wanted to take a moment to think about, this title that you proposed, which is Eco-Motion. Can you see it?
Yeah. No, it's not full thing mode.
Oh, okay. So let me put this in. Okay.
Yes.
So, is this okay? Yeah. So I was wondering if you could say a little about, your choice of title and where that's coming from.
This is actually, Eco-Motion is a recycled title. there was an occasion to contribute something for a magazine edited by friends, and I was interviewed by another friend / curator to build a contribution for the magazine together. I think it was 2008 or something. So it has been already 16 years ago. Yes.
Yeah.
And this word was coined in the discussion that, like ecology was already a concern among us to talk about. And it was very initial kind of response from my side that the first thing I came up in relation with ecology was the sense of loss, the feeling of have lost something. I'm not even specify what was lost, but I think that sensibility maybe motivate us to engage in something bigger than us, bigger than our body, what we call environment. But without that, without having the sense of the loss, I think it's very hard to engage ourselves so naturally and genuinely in ecology, because maybe I'm a pessimist, but we are such an egoistic being, and it's really hard to consistently engaging in something bigger than us, and without losing the hope, and keeping the genuinity. And for me, the trigger could be the feeling, the sentiment, the sentiment of loss. So when I asked to come back to Lahore to see my own work, but also maybe contribute something here, I thought this could be the beginning, what I can do as an artist. I'm not a curator, I'm not a theoretician, I'm not a critique. I have a hard time to objectify myself, what I'm doing. Like artists, practitioners are rather driven being. We jump into something that we don't know, we are not sure about. So I throw something that was there in my past and recycle it to make a beginning. And in this conversation, I think the motif I was exemplifying is the landscape, like a rural or like a natural landscape, but that interferes with, how do you call it, hydraulic?
Oh, the hydroelectric.
Hydroelectric?
Or hydro, yeah.
That, the landscape became something less pure and more hybrid. You can understand it as interrupted or disturbed by, something invasive, but with a goodwill and directed to the future, and what kind of feeling will be generated, and the sentiment will be most probably digested by us as a humanity and become a part of our culture, right? So I was imagining that landscape, like we will face, or we are facing more and more often, that interfered and hybrid with effort, man-made effort, but for the better purpose.
Yeah, and so, one of the interesting things about starting from this point is it also gives a certain way of understanding because the work that we see at Shalimar Spring Sailors, is responding to the kind of the microclimate of the gardens, right? And the way that the waterworks there, the waterways, aren't just about water, but also about creating a certain kind of air current that could cool things down, in the pavilions, right? And it's interesting to think about, you know, the quote that you just shared, but also this more recent project. And can you say a little more about, you know, your interest in wind?
I guess I just brought this slide for two reasons. One is, of course, the continuation of the use of the wind, but also to brought this to explain maybe the very banal daily life of artists making a decision every day, many little decisions every day that, that we choose the site, we choose the material, and thinking about what method to apply, what scale, etc. The work we are doing is the composition of so many different micro decisions. And recently this piece emerged in my Städelschule at Hayward. I think many funny circumstances. One is again the recycling aspect, that the artist before me built this very, very expensive and elaborated pool in the terrace, and I wanted to use the terrace, outdoor space, even if majority of my exhibition, of course, taking place indoor. And this dialogue between indoor and outdoor became much more conscious and desirable. However, my exhibition was taking place during the winter, so the door had to stay closed. No one is allowed to open the door and go out on the terrace to experience something. So what I could do is only using the terrace as a landscape.
Yeah.
Something to look at and trigger the imagination, and it might, with the hopeful wish that it might generate any kind of experience without being outside, without being able to feel the wind and the cold, etc. So I used the pool and then built this wind park.
Yeah.
And it's, I think, I'm only now processing it on my own because it has been very recent that for me as a sculptor it was interesting that my, let's say, ego that had no problem to recycle whatsoever, and how we can coexist, like artists before me who I don't know, and how he would take or how I would take. And the other thing is this idea of the miniature and the building a landscape that is not fully experienceable, but offered as a landscape and what to project on, etc.
Yeah, it's interesting because the slides that you've prepared for today kind of draw out certain things that maybe people wouldn't necessarily have thought of otherwise. But it is true that there is this continuity in terms of thinking about the movement of air in your work, right? Because I think if just to kind of something that isn't in the slides, but something which maybe people familiar with your work associate you with as a sculptor, using everyday materials like whether it's clothes dryers, right, or Venetian blinds, which is a kind of a common material that or item that people find in houses, and the way that you kind of use that material to create certain kind of objects. But it's also true that in your work it's also about sculpting or kind of certain invisible things, not solid things like the air, right? So even in the Venetian blind works, there's the kind of about the airflow and about the way things kind of move according to the way that the air current in the room can move, right? Or in this piece, the way that there's these pinwheels that kind of move according to the fans, right?
Yeah, I'm also thinking about why air and what what does it mean to use the air in our time, because we are not in the 60s where dematerialization was the motto for the artists to gather under. Also, I think we now living in a period where the scientific knowledge is very overwhelming. I think if we want, we can know much more about the substances and aerodynamics and all of this. However, so I look into the aerodynamic of it and climate as well. And on my very subjective way, I really dive into it because I go through, just it's very, again, banal motivation that I'm just going through many different time zones and climate zones than maybe average people. And it obviously caused a lot of thoughts and sentiment in me. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to understand more about how climate has played a role in the civilization and communities, specific region, etc. So many of the works and exhibition have something to do with that perspective. I think my research and observations are something very slow, like a snail, Mm-hmm. I don't have a, discipline and project that I can be consistent, so it's sometimes slow and sometimes extremely dramatic, and maybe I lost myself in it and I have to regain more rigorosity to continue, etc. So this has just happened. I think it will continue, but until now I can maybe mention 20 different projects which has something to do with climate or the civilizational touch with the climate concern, whether it is a sailor's wish for the safe sail in the ocean, or mostly very ritualistic concern, but sometimes scientific concern as well. And mysteriousness of the air dynamic itself, I think, remains the central topic for me. That's scientifically obviously most challenging to calculate and predict and regulate.
Okay, so can we maybe move to this project, which an opaque wind from 2015, which is a series of works actually that you began to make in Sharjah, and I think this started many things, right? It continued many things as well. One of them is kind of your interest in geometries. But also, I think your interest specifically in Islamic geometries and the way that geometry plays a role in Islamic aesthetics. Can you say more about how this project kind of was shaped by those concerns?
Yeah, it's also.
Among other things.
Yeah. So I just wanted to give you an overview because it was a complex project. But let's maybe focus on maybe this kind of tower-shaped sculpture, I would say, because many things are a bit centered around the two elements. One is the divider, and the other one is the tower. And then maybe third elements are room making. And this tower structure has a lot to do with the so-called wind towers in the Gulf countries. And many of the traditional housings in Gulf region are equipped with a wind tower in one corner because the airstream in the region is very known to be consistent, which means you can actually catch the wind consistently throughout the season and the time, and bring it down for the natural cooling and shoot it up to like as if the house would spit out the hot air. So many of the heritage buildings are equipped with wind towers.
Mm.
So it is maybe roughly say maybe my my interpretation, like contemporary interpretation of this heritage dignified wind tower. But I have to explain maybe the room making at the same time. And this room is titled as a father's room.
Mm.
And this is dedicated to a lot of workers have been active in the region, coming from many different places over the big period of time, including 60s Korean workers went to Gulf region in 60s. So this room is equipped with elements that I could imagine that can be either useful for those fathers or symbolically embodying those beings. And these towers also has something to do with those migrated workers, how they are fed into and maybe generate something and then escape or evaporate or and normally this story is very hidden. This migrating story is very hidden since my fathers and uncles and not only relatives but also neighbors have gone through this history that my generation literally grown up without men. And this is very, very unknown fact, a social fact in our society until today, maybe even more taboo than Vietnam War and whatsoever. When I got this invitation, I was determined to dig in that history and maybe come up with a methodology, at least try to get the first step how I can narrate this story with sculptural language and also express the very muteness of this story. I'm not a investigative journalist. My primary concern is not narrating to make it known, and I want to render the silence and the muteness around this migrant history. So this was quite a meaningful, let's say, sculptural attempt for me.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, should we keep going? Yeah. Okay. So then after Sharjah, this was a second iteration of Big Wind, which took place in Serapis, right, in the museum in Porto, Portugal. And so here you can see some of the kind of the interest in the wind towers and the kind of the airflow, but also kind of the elaboration of the form.
How do you call this Alhambra and all this influence?
Oh, the Alhambra. Moorish. Yeah.
Moorish influence. Yeah.
Yeah. So thinking about kind of the Moorish influence, yes, right, in the region, in the Iberian Peninsula. Yeah. And so building on that and working with that.
Yeah, with the geometry.
Yeah. The geometries. So, so it's 20, 15 minutes? Okay. So then maybe that brings us to Spring Sailor. So I think that this is kind of like a transition. So I was wondering if you could maybe say a little about the process. So then knowing that this is something that you had, this series Opaque Wind was something that you had developed. I was wondering if you could since we didn't have the chance to talk about it so much this morning, if you might be willing to kind of, share a little about the project, which is on view at the Shalimar Gardens, which is like it's I think working with architecture, which is in an Islamic context, right? But a very different kind of architecture. And then the airflow here is a different one. So how does it relate? How does it not relate to what we just saw with the opaque wind, I guess, is in your mind?
I guess when I made the site visit in Lahore, there were, within such a short amount of time, I found so many different motifs that I could work with. It was fascinating, like how stimulated I got. Really almost historical degree. And one of it was working with maybe his heritage side, kind of rendering the science and the wisdom of using the airflow for palaces and temples, and whether it is heat or wind, it's about how to channel it, make a conduit of it. And that was highly interesting. Now, at the beginning, I was of course very impressed by the appearance of the fort and the bricks, and so the brick was that one thing that I got very fascinated about. So we did some research about it.
Yeah.
And then the other part was this invisible airflow and temperature and the movement of the air.
It's interesting that the opaque wind, you were interested in the way that the wind towers, right, functioned within a Gulf state context, and thinking about how there's a certain kind of passive cooling technology. And we return to a different kind of passive cooling technology that we find at, with the Mughals at Shalimar Gardens. Yeah.
We already talked about it when we did a site visit. It's both the water and the wind, or water and the air, how you actually regulate by this architectural project. It's not an aesthetic exercise to show the glory of the authority, but also I guess it's a huge demonstration of high technology and understanding of science, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So, and then the other, at the same time, I was discovering the so-called mulberry paper. It's mulberry paper is what we know as how do we call rice paper? I think that's such a I think it's not a good term. Yeah. Anyway, so I no longer call it rice paper because the paper has nothing to do with the rice. It's made out of the bark of the mulberry or fig tree. And then you steam it and then skin off the bark, and then again skin off the outside of the bark, and then only the inner bark you actually use to make a fiber, and then weave together in water by sipping it in different direction and make this very resilient but delicate paper. And so I actually rediscovered so-called mulberry paper through shamanism, because I was fascinated all the paper props by using shamans in the various ritual, and that actually brought me to learn and study into different tradition of shamanism. Unlikely to the institutionalized religion, the shamanism is something left very wild like unorganized, uncentralized, and not institutionalized. I guess I learned a great deal by comparing between Korean shamanism and Japanese Shintoism. The Shintoism already started to taken by the ruling power, and centralized and made even a pantheon of different deities and made the rank of each deity. Whereas Korean shamanism left completely untreated by any power structure, meaning rather suppressed and how do you say, like demonized as the anti-modernistic tendency. Especially, we are talking about 60s and over 80s under the military dictatorship. Shamans and shamanism were heavily suppressed and kicked out of the city. They really had to move out, etc. So coming back to the paper, so in fact, when we thinking about the colonial sense, what has happened to our use of the paper, whether it is the career of the knowledge production or the craftsmanship, I think the wall is lost for the mulberry paper. It actually almost extinct except those ritualistic use or craftsmanship.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of rendering those marginalized area and what kind of resilient power is still around us, and that has been the deep background of why I'm doing this paper collages. And recently, I think only recently, I'm very slow. It already took me so long to obtain the technique, how to use the knife and cut the shapes. I think it's a years long kind of practice you need to train. It's not only the technique, but also I have to be in the right mindset. I don't know how to call it because I'm not aiming to become a shaman. I'm not spiritual enough, but I want to maybe come up with a certain degree of dignity, understanding of dignity, that I can practice this without being shameful and exploitative. So I'm making a small progress. So the kite or kite-like object is my second step, then moving into the three-dimensional space that so far I really had to focusing on the flatness because I really had to be able to using the knife. It's not a scissor, it's a knife. So I don't know, maybe this will explain to you how much power you need to cut this thing that I think when untrained persons start to assist me to cut, within a couple of hours your fingers will bleed. You really need some power to cut the folded paper in a very precise way without shifting the layers of, and you have to be very decisive.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, and so this is also, because what we're talking about with spring sailors, on the one hand, yes, they're kite forms, but there's also the collage or the kind of the pasting of these elements that we're seeing, right? The cut paper elements. That's done with the mulberry and the hanji, right?
But the hand-dyed paper.
Hand-dyed paper, yeah.
Most of mulberry papers are white.
Yeah.
And now I'm working with those dyed paper.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also done by the artisan. And they don't tell you how they dye the paper.
Yeah.
I think one day I will find out. But I'm slow. I don't want to be so intrusive. So I think it requires years-long relationship because it has certain artisanal tradition and anthropological study behind. I have to, how can I say, I have to make my pace according to them. So it's a bit slow process.
Okay. I mean, I guess one thing that I think is interesting about this review and kind of going into mesmerizing mesh and your interest in shamanism is the fact that you're also interested in these kind of folk practices. I guess maybe we can say, right? Whether it's shamanism, or in the case of, do you want to say anything about this, or should we? Yeah.
I guess. I think it's only within my own mental mapping. I think shamanism/paganism is the space that is the kind of negative space of centralized, dominating religious power. Mm-hmm. And all the rest I would call maybe shamanic or pagan spiritual space. And there are a lot of, the way of life and rituals belong to this space. And if I talk about the folk art, it's more about belonging. Like folk art, or folk art is primarily also the people's art. It's not a art belong to aristocracy or higher class of the society. It's like people's art, and that exists everywhere. But somehow I think that also built a weakness that each of us easily say this is ours and that's yours. Like those distinctions come along with this universal idea of people's art, and that trap I'm also kind of trying to render, or at least not to forget, if I treat the so-called the folk art. And working with the mulberry paper, I think I'm meandering all those spaces around.
Yeah, and I mean, it is, I think so, one way of understanding the Spring Sailors then is kind of taking this Mughal space, which is a royal space or imperial space, right? And introducing this project, which on the one hand is thinking about these kind of folk or kind of people's practices. And then also, more locally thinking about Basant, right? As a kind of a celebration of the spring, which is where the Spring Sailors come from, right? And the way that it's about people celebrating the arrival of spring. And so introducing maybe kind of like an egalitarian or more democratic kind of practice into this imperial space.
I mean, I would say there is maybe a debate about Basant, whether it is secular or sacred. Mm-hmm. How much of it is a secular tradition, how much of it is a sacred tradition, whether it is Hindu mythology-based or pagan tradition of celebrating spring. I mean, celebrating spring actually means, or it includes the good year, right? The good weather, good crop, like spring actually is the gateway into the whole year. So this celebrating spring actually exists many places, but it's very, very particular how passionately the kite flying or kite fighting has been combined with this spring festival. There is no singular explanation why these two are tightly connected. I guess maybe it has something to do with general idea of the kite that, one hand you can shape something. And number two, I think you can let it fly.
Yeah.
I think this combination of shaping, like narrating, and then let it fly, it's an incredible narrative. I mean, as an artist, I would say it's an amazing invention. And I think this is the format that you can envelope many messages into, but it's really particular. So now I'm really looking into the Kai tradition. But again, I think my interest is, of course, very artistic. And whether it is mulberry paper or Kai tradition, I guess the soul and the matter, this dual combination back to back, how much we can project soul into the matter, or how much the matter actually conveys the spiritual. I guess that's remains as a central question.
Yeah. I don't know if we have enough time to talk about the rest, so maybe we just leave it here. Is that okay?
Maybe opening up.
Yeah, so I think maybe at this point, we're at a point where we can open up the conversation to the floor. If people have questions they'd like to address to Haegue about her project or anything that they've heard during the talk.
I mean, if Silk Road could be a metaphor, I guess I am on a trip through my own Silk Road, maybe it's a mulberry road. I found, in fact, mulberry paper in Thailand and I'm still discovering. I mean, that's the joy of doing certain project, that because I'm working with this paper, like friends and acquaintances, they always bring and deliver some fascinating story to me. So I'm collecting more and more. So some work actually continues over a certain period. I guess that duration is necessary to gather. Like I become a kind of hub and I gather all this information, and it's quite a fascinating process. And by the way, so right now, so I have done I started with Korean journalism, and then I did this comparative study with the Japanese Shinto ritualistic object. Then I did a little bit of Slavic tradition, which is Vichinanki. And then I'm actually very massively moving into two paper tradition, but in Mexico. One is called the papel picado, and the other one is called amate. And it's two completely different regions of Mexico. And the amate is much more like a shamanism, based in indigenous community and ritualistic objects. So they really, the shaman would start the whole process getting the knife and going into the mountain and cut the mulberry bark, make the paper and, making a ritual. So it's a whole paper making and ritual making is completely merged. And there is a collection and books about it, but it's not even much known, even in Mexico. And then the second one is papel picado, that the original papel picado is less known. And a lot of books talking about the Chinese tissue paper. The arrival of Chinese tissue paper was the beginning of the papel picado, which is very, very contemporary, celebratory decoration. So these two seems like very different, but I'm kind of doing a dual research. And for me, the research is always also come hands in hand with the production. I don't think I can do production afterwards. That's what I meant, that I often, many of the production, I already doing it without knowing so much. So it's more like parallel process. So I'm working towards one exhibition coming up in February in Mexico City with this amate and papel picado tradition. And I guess that there will be continuation of my mulberry road.
Okay.
When, as a young artist, I used to hate that word memory. I found it cheesy, but more and more I really do appreciate it. I got to contemplate on that word a lot. I guess many things that funnily enough, many things I'm interested in, they are rather like oral histories. I guess, for instance, shamanism, it doesn't have any sutra. There is no written down sutra. So a lot of shamans, they had to learn all their lyrics by heart. So it's really, and I guess the many of the folk art, there is also no centralized way of doing things. I guess the richness of folk art lies in the variation from village to village, from person to person, and I guess that's the vitality or resilience or whatever we would call it that I think we get fascinated by. And I guess many of my interest lies into start from kind of critical or even skeptical self-reflection that I feel more close to the anthropologist than the artist, I guess, because I don't really feel so Burmanian. But however, I think I feel a deep awe, and again, I don't think I'm trying to become a spiritual person, but I am fascinated by the phenomena of spirit and how this phenomena continued without a stop, and how it is possible. That's my fascination, I guess. Why we as a civilization keep those things and let it continue, and what would be the significance that we keep seeing it over and over again, and take it on our hand and insist that it's ours, but ours in a broader sense, more inclusive sense than exclusive sense, and that is really my question.
Okay, so I'm getting a signal for time, so maybe this is a place to wrap up. So thank you so much, Haegue, for sharing this presentation with us. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We will continue tomorrow with a talk by Anthony Achavari, who's in the room with us here. We'll be at Alhambra Art Center in Hall 3 starting at 6 o'clock tomorrow night.